and left off last time about what we're doing with these interactive models, right? So we had talked about in our additive models, and we talked before, for the purposes of this first assignment, wanting you to say, oh, this is the relation between x and y, holding all other variables constant at 0. But in an additive model, it doesn't matter what those other variables are held constant at, right? The relation between x and y is going to be identical, right? With our additive model, there's no way for one predictor to, if I change the value of that predictor, there's no way for that to actually modify the regression coefficient for another predictor, right? It's always going to be the same. When we can go through and we start including interactive terms, this is when we start to see, within the context of a single model, if I start changing the value of one variable, that can start to change the expected impact of another variable on my outcome, right? We went through a small example of having you go through, factor things out, and then with the bigger model that we're going to work with here, going through and taking your full regression model, right, and going through and restructuring, right, to make explicit. So we've got two interactions in this first model. What we're looking at is PTSD is our conditional effect, okay? Pain is our moderator. PTSD is our conditional effect. When we're talking about a conditional effect, it just means some factor that the nature of that relation is going to change depending on the level of some other variable. Here, we're seeing that maybe the relation between PTSD on functioning is going to be dependent on level of pain, right? And so what we can do mathematically is take this regression model with the interaction terms and start breaking it down to see actually how that's taking place, right? So remember, we go through and we restructure, and when we go through and restructure this, we can see that now my effect of pain on outcome is going to be dependent on whether or not I say someone is taking opiates or not, right? Because if I put different values of opiate use in here, it's going to change this whole term, right? And this whole term is the slope, the regression slope of pain on my outcome. So depending on what value I plug into here, it's going to start changing my coefficient. Same thing with PTSD. PTSD is my conditional relation here, right? Depending on what value of pain, this is going to change the coefficient of, or the slope of PTSD on functioning, so that as pain increases or pain decreases, it's going to change what this value is here, right? And so this is how we can see mathematically what's going on and why these interaction terms allow us to start modeling change in the relation between two variables based on some level of the third variable, okay? So again, we can see that pain is now conditioned or dependent on opiate use. PTSD is dependent or conditioned on pain. So then we go through and we talk about, within this model, we can break it down and get our simple slopes, right? All of this we can do by hand. We can go through and with some slick algebra, get a simple slope for the relation of PTSD with outcome at high pain, the relation of PTSD with outcome at low pain, okay? And we see here, if we just look at these, right, these are comparable. Looks like we have a much stronger relation between PTSD and functioning at low levels of pain than we do at high levels of pain. Same thing, we can do the same thing with opiate use. We can do all this by hand, right? And we see that it appears that we have a stronger negative relation between pain and functioning for people who aren't using opiates than compared to people who are using opiates, okay? And then we always want to go through and plot these out, right? And we see that here we have two what appear to be negative relations. As pain increases, functioning decreases, but it looks like that relation is stronger for people who aren't taking opiates as compared to those who are. Here with PTSD, looks like PTSD holds a negative relation with functioning at low levels of pain, right? So is PTSD, if we're talking about individuals who have low levels of pain, as your PTSD increases, your functioning decreases. But if we're talking about people with high levels of pain, swamps it out, right? My functioning is crap no matter what. It doesn't matter what my PTSD levels are at. I could have zero PTSD, but if I'm just in severe chronic pain, my functioning isn't worth anything ever, right? And so we actually, it looks like we see a non-relation. Actually, it looks like we have a positive relation between PTSD and functioning here, right? And so we can do all this by hand, and you'll need to do this by hand. You'll want to know how to do this by hand. But what we can't get out of this is whether or not these individual slopes are statistically significant. They look like it, but I don't know. We need some sort of formal test of this, right? And so this is where we go through and plot, right? And talked about going through and restructuring in SPSS. What we're going to do, let's say we're looking at the conditional effect of PTSD on role functioning at high and low levels of pain, right? What we're going to do is we're going to go into our data set and we're going to recenter pain so that a zero value corresponds to high levels and low levels, right? And so here in our centered variable, we've got centered pain where 0 is equal to the mean, right? But what we're going to do we're going to create a new variable called high pain, and what we're going to do is we're going to subtract a standard deviation from every score. It seems counterintuitive. You'll screw this up, you'll flip this around, but it makes sense if you think about it, because if here, right, Morgan has average levels of pain. She's at 0, right? But if I subtract a standard deviation from Morgan's now has a negative score, right? So average levels of pain now correspond to a value of negative 2.3, and 0 now corresponds to high levels of pain, right? Same thing if we take everybody's, create a new variable that's called low pain, and we add a standard deviation. Morgan is at 0 levels, she's at average levels of pain, but if we add a standard deviation, now mean level of standard deviation, it corresponds to a value of 2.3. 0 now corresponds to low levels of pain, right? And so this is why it's important to always know what your 0 value corresponds to, because it's going to help you with the interpretation of these different models. So we go through, we create new variables, high pain and low pain, and then what we're going to do is we're going to create 2 new interaction terms, right? We're going to take high pain times my centered PTSD variable, low pain times centered PTSD variable. So I've got new sets of variables for new models that I'm going to run. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through for low pain. I'm going to substitute in my original regression model, in my base model, I'm going to substitute my low pain variable that I calculated here and my low pain interaction terms for my other interaction term, any interaction term that has pain in it. And this is going to give me, and then if I look at my coefficient for PTSD, this is going to be the relation or my effective PTSD on my outcome at low levels of pain. Right? Same thing if I substitute in my base regression model my high pain variable, my high pain interactions. Now I'm going through, and if I look at my coefficient for PTSD, this is going to correspond to this, the conditional effect of PTSD on outcome at high levels of pain. Okay. And we're going to go through an example of this so you see. But if we're looking at centering our additive models, nothing happens here, right? We see a difference in my constant with centered and uncentered solutions. But with my multiplicative models, we start to see some important effects here. Primarily with my collinearity diagnostics, right? How do those tolerance values look there? I don't know this. So we look at your own printout. How do my tolerance and VIFs look in the uncentered solution? Bad, right? That's what collinearity looks like, right? Centering helps reduce some of that collinearity, and it's also going to help us simplify our simple slopes when we jump into those, okay? So here's an example of our simple slopes model. Here's our baseline model, okay? Here's my constant, a coefficient for pain, opiate use, PTSD, interaction of opiate use and pain, interaction of opiate use and PTSD, okay? As we go down through, I take a look at my low pain model. This is where I've substituted in my low pain variable, my low pain interaction here, right? I'm looking at the conditional effect of PTSD on outcome at low levels of pain, okay? What I see is a change in my intercept, but everything else is identical except for my simple slope of PTSD, right? This is the conditional effect of PTSD on my outcome at low levels of pain, right? And And so relative to my base model, I've got a stronger negative effect than in my base model. Same thing if I rerun this analysis at high levels of pain. Substitute in my model, I have high pain, opiate use, PTSD, high pain and opiate use, high pain and PTSD. I see everything stays identical except for my constant, which makes sense, and then my conditional effect of PTSD, right? Now we have something that's not statistically significant, right? And so what we're doing with our simple slopes, we can calculate our simple slopes by hand. There's nothing in this, in terms of our coefficients, at least for our unstandardized coefficients, that we can't get just based on factoring out our model. But what we can't take a look at is we can't get our statistical significance of our conditional effects at high and low levels of pain. We also can't derive, it would be hard to derive effect sizes, right, at high and low levels, right? And so this is where we can hijack SPSS to get us back in and start working with some of this stuff, okay? Also notice that I've crossed out your standardized coefficients. This is because remember that when SPSS is creating your standardized solution, right? When SPSS is giving you your standardized coefficients, all the program is doing is it's taking, say I've got, in this model I've got pain, opiate use, and PTSD. Let's just say we have first order effects here, right? All SPSS is doing is creating Z-scores for my outcome, Z-scores for pain, opiate use, and PTSD, and then regressing the Z-score for my outcome onto the Z-scores for each one of my predictors, right? You can get your standardized effects on your own by replicating this, right? So if you, in your SPSS, if you were to just hit descriptives, save standardized scores, and then thrown in functioning, pain, opiate use, and PTSD, right? And so then you got 4 new variables that are Z-scores for all of those. And then if you just regress, run the same model, except you just use Z-scores instead of raw scores, you're going to get in your unstandardized effects in that standardized model are going to be equal to your beta weights in the model that you ran with your raw scores. Okay. Now the problem is that when we're working with interaction terms, remember that we need, in order for this interaction term to make sense, we need to be able to pull it apart. We need to be able to decompose it algebraically. And what happens is that we need to have this multiplicative effect be the component of my 2 base scores, right? What ends up happening is SPSS, so we've gone through and physically created our interaction term, right? What SPSS does is it just takes the Z-score of your interaction term. And the Z-score of your interaction term, the Z-score of the opiate times pain interaction isn't the same thing of the Z-score of your opiate use and the Z-score of your pain, right? Those 2 things aren't the same. We can factor this out, we can't factor that. Same thing here, pain and PTSD, right? If we wanted to create an appropriate interaction, a standardized interaction, we would take, in SPSS, we take the Z-scores of pain and multiply them by the Z-scores of PTSD to give us a proper interaction term. That we can pull apart, right? But if we just take the centered pain and the centered PTSD scores and multiply those together, and then take the Z-score of that product term, I can't get back to here with that, right? And so in order to go through and get an appropriate standardized score, and this will be important, right? You're going to run moderation models and you're going to want to report standardized scores, which is fine. Just know that when you do that, you're going to have to take a couple extra steps because SPSS won't give you the appropriate standardized scores for your interaction terms, okay? What you're going to need to do is you're going to need to take all of your first order variables. In this case, it would be functioning, pain, opiate use, and PTSD. You would need to calculate Z-scores for all of those. And then you would need to take the Z-scores for your interaction terms. So here you need to take opiate use and pain, the Z-score for opiate use, the Z-score of pain, multiply those to create a new Z-score of your interaction, right? And then you would need to take pain and PTSD and multiply the Z-score for pain, the Z-score of PTSD to produce another standardized interaction, and then run your model where you're regressing the Z-score of your outcome onto the z-score of opiate use, z-score of pain, z-score of PTSD, and then the interaction terms that you created with the z-scores in that regression model. Okay, and in that output, what are you going to interpret as? Where are you going to find the standardized effects for your interactions? The appropriate standardized effects. Your unstandardized coefficient, right? Your unstandardized coefficient is going to be your standardized interaction term, the appropriate standardized interaction term, right? Because that coefficient is going to be based on the product of the z-score of x1 and x2, not the z-score of that product term. Okay. Questions on this? And you can play around with this. This is easy, right? You've gone through and looked at z-scores anyway. You've got them in your set when you're doing your screenings and things like that, right? If you go through and just in a standard regression model stuff from this last one, if you pull up your data set and you have z-scores in there, regress your z-scores from your outcome on the z-scores of your predictors, and then look at your unstandardized effects in that model and compare them against the standardized effects in your just the regression model that you ran for the assignment. They're going to be identical. Okay, so just wanting you to know this is something again that 99 times out of 100 a reviewer's never going to catch it, but it's just not right. In science, we should probably try and do things right if we can, right? Not just do what we can get away with, right? So just be aware that this is something that goes on. Okay. All right. Questions on any of this? Okay. So let's jump in. So grab your sheet here. We're going to work through this pretty quickly. We've already kind of gone through the model already. But what we want to do first with our model is we're going to go through analyze descriptives. I'm going to look at pain severity, opiate use, and PTSD total. Now, we're not going to do anything too crazy with this because we've already gone through and screened this set. We've got funky stuff with the outcome variable because it's not actually a continuous variable. It's a really skewed ordered categorical variable, but we're going to ignore that for right now. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to ask for descriptive statistics for all of my predictors here. So what I want to do here is I want to start by centering my variables, okay? Anytime you run a regression model, it's probably best if you're centering variables. It's just going to aid in interpretation. A lot of times 0 isn't a real score on what we're doing, right? But if we center, 0 now becomes equal to what? The mean value, right? So we were saying this is the relation between x and y mean values of everything else, right? So we're going to go through go compute. I'm going to call this center pain minus 4.0702 and execute. Opioid is going to be my opioid variable minus the mean of my opiate use, 0.50. So what I've done here is I've just created, told SPSS to create 3 new variables. These 3 new variables are going to be my centered predictors. Do we need to center my outcome? Nope, don't center your outcome, because you get confused and try to do that. So thwart future self from trying to do this right now and say don't center your outcome variable. Okay. Now, when you're on your standardized model, yeah, you'll need to standardize your outcome too, but for just standard centering, you just standardize your predictor, or center your predictors, not your outcome. Okay. Now, most of these make sense. The only weird thing we've got here is we've centered opiate use, right? And now we're centering opiate use. Why is the mean of opiate use 0.5? Because I've got a balanced design. I've got almost identical numbers of people in each. This will, centering your dichotomous indicators will not always be subtracting 0.5. Okay, that's again something you'll probably get yourself turned around on. But this centered opiate use makes sense. It's a dichotomous variable. It's either 0 or it's 1. How do I interpret that centered variable? What's that? Yeah, but the coefficient in the model, right, is going to be, because otherwise, if I have a model like this where I have opiate use as part of a conditional effect, if I leave it at 0, then I'm specifically looking at people without use, and if that variable is now included in another, it starts to get a little bit tricky, right? So in the base model, in my base model, if I just center this, I'm just saying this is the relation of PTSD with my outcome controlling for opiate use, right? I've just taken opiate use out of the mix, right? I'm not looking at specifically at people at 0 or 1. I'm just saying we're taking opiate use and pulling that out, right? So if we sort of just collapse across opiate use and don't worry about it, like this is the relation, okay? Now we're going to play around with this a little bit later on in the demonstration, but that's kind of what's going on here, right? So people with 0 holding all other variables constant at 0, holding opiate use constant at 0 in this case isn't going to make a whole lot of sense practically, because 0 is an actual value that anybody has. But we're just saying that this is a relation of PTSD and outcome controlling for or accounting for opiate use, however you want to say it. Okay. So we're going to go through and we're going to run that, and if we look in our SPSS file here, you'll see we've got new variables: pain, centered opiate use, centered PTSD, right? If we go through and we take a look, we can see for opiate use we've got now -5s and 5s for people. Again, the only reason it worked out that way is because we've kind of got a balanced design. What I like to do after I've centered things, anytime then I'll go through and I'll take a look at my descriptives. Take descriptives for my centered variables. Okay. The reason I do this is because I screw it up all the time. I'll subtract a standard deviation or something dumb like that, right? Because I'm not paying attention. What should we see in our descriptives for our centered variables? What should our mean be? 0, right? If we go through, we take a look, here's our mean. Means for my centered variables are now 0. Looks like it's not an exact even split with opiate use. I mean, if I would have had more decimals out there, I might have, but this is close enough, right? Note that my standard deviation doesn't change though. All I did is I just took this distribution and shifted it, so now 0 is the middle of that distribution, but my spread or my variability of scores is still identical. This is going to be important. Okay, so I've got that. That's feeling good about that. That's looking good. So what I want to do now, for the purposes of this example, is we go through, I go analyze, regression linear, and I take a look at role function as my outcome, and if I just look at my uncentered variables here, and if I look at for part and partials, collinears, we won't worry about case-wise diagnostics and things like that, because we've already taken a look and screened those data. We won't save anything here, so I'll just go through and paste this down, okay? But then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that model that I just produced with my uncentered variables, and I'm going to go through and punch in my centered variables. Okay. As you start to work with these with this SPSS syntax, you'll notice you'll probably start running everything, stop running everything through the pull down, just because it's more efficient to just go through. Here's my statement for my regression model, regressing role functioning onto pain, opiate use, and PTSD. I'm just going to run the same model using centered pain, centered opiate use, and centered PTSD. Okay. All I had to do is, since I had this up here anyway, I just cut and pasted that down into that thing, and it's the same model. We're just running through it a little bit more quickly than having to go through and search for things. Particularly if I have a big data set with 500, 600 variables trying to figure out where stuff is, this can be a much easier, quicker way to go through and do stuff. Okay. So if I go through and I run these models, what I'm going to see, so this is my centered model, and the output, or the relevant output, is here on your handout. We can go through and take a look. So for my uncentered model and compare that with my centered model, everything's identical, right? Just for this additive model, if you're looking again at our handout here, what's the only difference between these two models, the two additive models, Katie? The constant. That's the only thing that's different, right? Because again, remember that we're predicting our constant represents the expected value of our outcome with all other variables held constant at 0. In my uncentered model, that's where everybody has a 0 score. So in my uncentered model, we're talking about people with a pain score of 0, people who aren't using opiates, and who people have no PTSD. We're seeing an expected value of functioning that's quite a bit higher than my than my centered model, right? Because here we're talking about expected value of role functioning for people who have average levels of pain, average levels of PTSD, holding opiate use constant, right? And so here we see a much lower level of expected functioning, because we're talking about people who have average levels of pain, average levels of PTSD, right? So again, with these models, always important, and particularly when you go and if you start doing like HLM types of stuff, or different types of growth curve modeling, things like that, what that 0 value means starts to become very important in interpreting the model and setting these things out. Okay. Lauren, my correlation is different, my collinearity statistics different? No. No, right? Because again, centering doesn't impact any of this stuff. Now, these collinearity statistics, if I were to run my my multiplicative model, then it's going to change, right? Centering helps reduce collinearity between my product terms and my first order terms, so we would see a difference here. But really, the only thing centering does in your additive models is just it'll change your constant and improve your interpretation, but that's about it. Questions on that? Okay. So what we're going to do now, though, because we're tired of we're bored with our additive models, and we want to run a moderation model. So I'm going to go compute, and I'm going to say pain times PTSD is going to equal centered pain, centered pain times centered PTSD. And now I'm going to go through and I'm going to create another variable. This one's going to be pain. And then here I'm going to take product of opiate use, pain, and these are going to be my interaction terms. I'm going to run those, and again in your model, or in your data set, you're going to see two new variables here, okay? These are your product terms. We have to create, in this module of SPSS, we have to create our own interaction terms, right? But these interaction terms are now the product of our two centered variables, right? But this becomes important because it's an actual product term, we can factor these out, right? What ends up happening if we go through and why we run into problems with our standardized effects is that SPSS is just going to take the z-score of this and the z-score of that, right? If I take the z-score of these two interaction terms, I've lost the pieces, I can't pull it apart, right? So what I need to do if I want to get standardized coefficients for my interaction terms, what I would need to do is I would need to physically create interaction terms that are the composite of the z-score of x1, the z-score of x2 to go through and take a look at that, okay? So we've gone through and done this, and so now what we're going to do is I'm going to go through and I'm going to say, all right, take my regression statement, paste this back down, and now I'm just going to add in my predictors. PTSD and pain, and opiate use and pain. Okay. And now I'm back down to where I am. So again, these regression statements, I mean, sometimes depending on what bells and whistles you want, you can pull those down out of the pull down menu. But once you've got kind of your template, then it's just a matter of changing it, what predictors you have in there. It ends up being fairly easy and straightforward. Okay. So you're going to run this. All right. And so here we see my overall model, right? I've got my R squared, or my multiple correlation, my R squared, right? Looks like the best linear combination of pain, opiate use, PTSD, and the interaction of pain and PTSD and opiate use and pain is accounting for close to 43% of the variability in role functioning. So I've got a pretty good model here, right? I see that my overall model is statistically significant, telling me that the combination of my predictors is accounting for non-zero variability in my outcome. That's fairly obvious with a sample of over 200, but that's my formal statistical test, right? And then as I go down through and I take a look at my coefficients, I look over here at my collinearity diagnostics. These are all looking pretty good, right? They wouldn't be if I hadn't centered these my variables before I started creating interaction terms. But if I go down through, Sam, tell me what you're seeing in this model here. Yep, it's the one that's sitting, yeah, this one right here. Yeah, it's kind of hard to see, but. It's this. What's it? Yeah. Well, yeah, just tell me the coefficient. We went through model-based stuff already. Okay. So what are we seeing with this? Give me some interpretations. interaction terms, we can attach a practical interpretation to our interactions, but it has to do with the change in the coefficient for your conditional effect given a unit increase in your moderator, so don't worry about that. Okay, don't try and attach it. I mean, you could do it, but I won't make you run through those mental gymnastics for trying to give me a practical interpretation for your interaction effects. But what we've got here, if we're taking a look, right, we're ended up, and we've got an effective pain, an effective PTSD. Can I make a strong interpretation of those coefficients in this base model? What do you think, Maureen?
It looks like the pain PTSD interaction is significant, but the opioid pain interaction is not, or marginally.
We'll call that close enough. Okay. So again, anybody who wants to quote me with you about .051 is a moron, okay, and doesn't understand sort of basic understanding of things. There's someone who likes cut points. So I would say we've got two significant interactions, right? So given the presence of these interactions, can I make strong interpretations of PTSD and pain? Why do you say no, Stephanie?
Oh, because it tells us that there's a different, the relationship is different based on whether you are or not feelings or at high.
Exactly, right? So this tells us, this interaction tells us, the significant interaction tells us that the nature of the relation between pain and functioning is dependent on opiate use. And it tells us that the relation between PTSD and functioning is dependent on pain. Or we could flip this around and say the relation between pain and functioning is dependent on PTSD, and the relation of opiate use and functioning is dependent on pain levels, right? These interaction terms are interchangeable, right? So this is where you need to have a good conceptualization. What's your base relation and what's your moderator, right? In general, your base relation is the thing that's been demonstrated in the literature over and over and over and over and over and over and over again, right? Well, we're interested in looking under what conditions does this relation, does this association hold, right? But these interaction terms are mathematically interchangeable. There's no empirical basis for interpreting it one way or the other. Now, sometimes, if we take a look at this, so I see that in the way we've set this up, we've talked about the relation of pain on functioning for people who are and aren't using opiates, right? We could also use opiates at different levels of pain, right? But if we take a look at our coefficients, that starts to get a little tricky because opiate use doesn't have a relation with functioning, right? And so we can start to back ourselves into, have to run through some gymnastics to talk about the strength of a non-relation with an outcome that's dependent on something else, right? And so what might happen is I might find that at high levels of pain, opiate use does have a relation with role functioning. At low levels of pain, opiate use doesn't. But again, I'm basing this as pain is a moderator of a non-relation, which can start to get a little tricky. I mean, you can do it. It just starts to become, it's conceptually easier, just given the way these things panned out, to talk about opiate use as changing the nature of the relation between pain and functioning than the other way around, because I'm talking about moderation of the non-effect. Sometimes what can happen is you look at your moderator, you might find that opiate use still doesn't have, opiate never holds a unique relation with outcome. It's just that non-effect is stronger at high levels of pain or low levels of pain, which is kind of an interpretive nightmare, right? So number one thing you should be doing is conceptualizing your interpretation of your interactions based on conceptually what makes the most sense, but knowing that there sometimes are empirical reasons for interpreting it one way versus another. Okay. So Alex, just to recap, if I take a look and I see a significant interaction term, what does that tell me? someone help Alex along in terms of like a practical interpretation? What, like, literally, and again, always when you're working, say, look, what does this literally mean, right? What do you think, Angela?
The nature between one of the predictors and the outcome variable is dependent upon the other predictor.
Exactly. It's just a dependency, right? Just like an interaction term in ANOVA, right? If you say, what's the relation between X and Y? I can't tell you in the presence of an interaction, a significant interaction, unless I know the value of that other predictor, right? It's just saying that the nature of the relation between my predictor and my outcome is dependent on some other variable, right? And the change in that relation is statistically reliable. Okay. So we know, based on this output, that at least the way we've set this up, that the relation between PTSD and functioning is dependent on pain. And the relation between pain and functional outcome is dependent on opiate use. Okay? That's what we're getting from this. And so we wouldn't start probably, just like with ANO, probably not make strong interpretations of this effect of pain and PTSD. If we wanted to make a strong interpretation of this, how would we, Katie, what would be the literal interpretation of this coefficient for pain right now? Or not the, like, so you don't have to tell me you change in X, you change in Y type of thing, but how would we interpret that as this effect for pain? Yeah, so on this, so we're interested in this coefficient for pain in my base model. How would I interpret that? Okay, do we have high levels of pain? What's the level of pain there? Okay, and what does 0 represent? Okay, so how would we, with that in mind, how would we interpret our coefficient for pain here? Not average levels of pain. What's pain? What's our main interaction term here? Or one of our interactions? I guess pain. How about this? Pain involved in a couple of interaction terms. Let's scrap that. What about the coefficient for PTSD? How would you evaluate, or how would you interpret your coefficient for PTSD in this base model? No, just the main effect of PTSD. Anybody help her out? What am I fishing for? What do you think, Angela?
Average levels of pain.
There we go. No. Yeah.
Yeah. Am I
Yep.
interpreting the PTSD one?
Yep.
Okay, so at average levels of pain and holding opioid use constant, and inclusive of average in PTSD, and increase in PTSD severity would be associated with a 0.2 decrease in role functioning.
Okay, yeah. This is just, in simple terms, what we've modeled here, because PTSD is conditioned on pain, right? This isn't a direct effect, it's a conditional effect, right? But this just represents the relation of PTSD with outcome at average levels of pain, right? Because pain's centered at 0, 0 represents average levels of pain. And so what this represents is this is just, it's still a conditional effect, right? If you say what's the relation between PTSD and outcome, I still say, well, I don't know, I have to know what level of pain. But based on how we've modeled it here, my coefficient for PTSD represents the relation of PTSD with my outcome at average levels of pain. Or I could say, this is, if we wanted to flip around, right, make pain my conditional effect. This is a relation of pain with outcome at average levels of PTSD. Right? Or this is the level of pain at average levels of PTSD holding opioid use constant, right? Or controlling for opiate use, right? So again, within this base model, right, our conditional effects represent the relation of our predictor with our outcome at average levels of that moderator. Okay, you kind of see where that's coming from. So again, this is why beating you guys over the head about like thinking about what's the literal interpretation of these variables? Well, this is the relation between x and y when everything else is held constant at 0. In an additive model, that really doesn't matter. But as soon as we have interaction terms, that starts to mean a whole lot, right? Because if this term is involved in an interaction, and that interaction is statistically significant, it means that if I start changing the level of that moderator, this coefficient, I should expect that to change in a reliable fashion, right? Now, if your interaction term isn't statistically significant, then we would say, well, this is just kind of a direct effect because it's not involved. We would say we would, based on our model, we failed to find evidence for a moderation of this relation based on something else, right? And so we wouldn't assume that this is going to change a whole lot. Now, numerically it will because we just sort of set it up that way, right? It might change a little bit, but it's not a reliable effect. But if it is involved in statistically significant interaction, we're saying that this association is going to change depending on the other term in our multiplicative term there, okay? People understand kind of what we're looking at our base model. Okay, what I'm going to do is switch over to this because I changed this sheet around. So we see here that I've got let's work with our pain and our PTSD interaction first, right? Because that's looks like a fairly strong statistical effect, right? If I look at my part and partial correlations, looks like my PTSD and pain is the stronger of the two interactions, right? And so first thing I want to do is plot these out. I want to see what this looks like, okay? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my base model and I'm going to physically factor this out. Factor this out by hand. This is important because one, it'll help you plot your simple slopes. Two, it's going to help you make sure that you run everything else the same, okay? So again, remember, we did this in lecture. If this is my function for roll function based on my base model, right? My intercept, coefficient for pain, opiate use, PTSD, and my two interaction terms, okay? And what I'm interested in this point here, I'm interested in the conditional effect of PTSD on functioning at high and low levels of pain, right? So I want to get my simple slopes for PTSD at high and low levels of pain. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start factoring this out. So I've got two interaction terms in this, which makes it a little bit complicated. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take, here's my main function here, and I'm going to say, all right, I want to go through and restructure this to look at the conditional effect of PTSD, okay? So I've got this, and so what I want to do is I want to get PTSD, factor this out. So I'm going to drop down my intercept. Pain is not my conditional effect, so I'm going to drop that down. Opiate use, not a part of a conditional effect, so I'm going to drop that down, right? But I've got PTSD. PTSD is part of a conditional effect, so I'm going to hold on to that. Here I've got pain times PTSD, I'm going to hold on to that. But here's this opiate use times pain interaction. I'm going to drop that in there, okay? And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to factor my my coefficients that have pain involved, right? Because that's my conditional effect. So here I'm going to take the 1.85 for PTSD and drop it in here, and my PTSD by interaction. If I factor PTSD out of that, now I've got plus 0.170 times pain, right? And here's my moderation function right here, right? I can now see that the relation of PTSD with my outcome is going to be dependent on what value I dump in for pain, okay? Then if I go through here, and remember that we're holding things constant at 0, right? Well, pain is going to be, I'm going to start changing values for pain, so I'm going to hold on to that. But opiate use is always going to be held constant at 0. So if I multiply anything times 0, that goes away, right? So that's gone. And then I have an opiate use times pain by a coefficient. Again, if I drop 0 in for opiate use, that goes away. And so what I'm left with is this equation where I've got my intercept, my effect for pain, and then my factored conditional effect for PTSD. Okay. And And then what I'm going to do, if we go up and we take a look, so I'm looking at my standard deviation for pain, right? And what I'm going to do is I want to look at the relation of role functioning, or PTSD with role functioning at high and low levels of pain. So I'm going to take this equation that I've got here, right? And I'm going to start plugging in low levels of pain. And low levels are going to be a standard deviation below. I've centered it, right? So my mean is 0. So low levels of pain are just minus a standard deviation, right? So if I drop in negative 1.342 for pain, negative 1.32 for pain here, I get this, calculate that out, and this ends up being my simple slope for the conditional effect of PTSD on functioning at low levels of pain. If I take this, my factored equation here, again restated, except now put 1.342, right? That's a standard deviation above. Drop that in there, calculate it out. I now have my simple slope for PTSD at high levels of pain. And the thing to notice here is at low levels of pain, I have a much larger coefficient, right, than at high levels of pain. But if I take these two now, so now I've got my simple slopes for PTSD, my simple slope, or simple slopes at low pain, simple slope function at high pain. And then if I just go through, and within these two, so I've got my relation between PTSD and role functioning at low levels of pain, and then I just take a standard deviation, say at low levels of PTSD is going to be negative 19.75. If I plug that in, I'm going to get this point, right? If I take high levels of pain, PTSD, it's going to be 19.75. Drop that in here. This is going to give me, or excuse me, this is going to give me my 2 points here that I can create my simple slopes. Right? Same thing if I take my high pain equation, I take low PTSD is negative 19.75, drop that in here, gives me that point. High PTSD, 19.756, drop that here, I get this point. I want to open this up in SPSS or in Excel, right? For PTSD and pain, see, I've just got my simple slopes equation up here, right? So I'm looking at low PTSD, low pain, and I've got low PTSD, high pain, right? Same thing. See here. Here, this is my my PTSD at high pain. Again, this is just my simple slopes equation here with negative 19.76, positive 19.76, and this gives me my simple slopes. People see how I got that, put that together? Okay. So we go through, what we've done is we've just calculated our simple slopes equation and plotted out the exact nature of this interaction at high and low levels of pain and PTSD, using the convention of a standard deviation above and below. If you have a good reason to use some different value, you can go ahead and do that, right? The statistics police aren't going to beat down your door if you use some other value. It's just, this has intuitive meaning, and so we go through and we can say, all right, this is what this interaction looks like based on our calculations. What are we missing from this? What does this not tell us, Morgan? Because we just cranked this out by hand because we're algebra heroes.
Because maybe you don't understand, like, it doesn't tell us where they're going to interact. Obviously, we can see that they'll interact, but because you don't really understand what you're asking.
What can't we, and that's a good point, there are other procedures. If we were interested and wanted to know where these lines intersected, there's procedures we can go ahead and do that. We won't work on them here, but we could do that. What are we getting from these hand calculations here? Significance and effect sizes, right? I can't tell you what the effect size is for PTSD, for the unique effect of PTSD on functioning at low levels of pain and high levels of pain based on this. I could probably get it, but I'd have to do some extra legwork, and that wouldn't be worth my time, right? I also can't test the statistical significance of this. And again, this starts to become important here, right? So I don't know, this doesn't look like, this looks pretty flat, but maybe at high levels of pain, PTSD has a positive association with role function. As my symptoms get worse, I get function better. I hope not, because that's going to be hard to explain, but this is a positive slope, right? I want to be able to tell my readers that this is actually a zero slope. I mean, the coefficient is positive in that it is not negative, but this does not represent a relation between PTSD and functioning at high levels of pain, okay? This is where I need to go back in and start working through jump back into SPSS, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at test my simple slopes at high and low levels of pain, okay? So again, I'm going to go back up and grab my descriptives here. Just so I have this in front of me so I can see. All right. And what I want to do, right, and this is going to be important. What's my conditional effect and what's my moderator, the way I've set this up? What do you think, Lauren? Moderator's pain, right? And so what I want to do is I want to model the relation between PTSD and functioning at high and low levels of my moderator. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go, I'm going to create a new variable, and I'm going to call this low pain, okay? And low pain is going to equal my centered pain variable plus a standard deviation, 1.3417. Compute. The same thing, this time minus the standard deviation. Okay. And then what I'm going to do, low pain times PTSD equal low pain times centered PTSD compute. Pain times PTSD and okay. So what I've done here is I've gone through and I've calculated a new variable, right? We're going to go through, we're going to run this. If we look at our SPSS output, now we have two new variables. We have low pain and high pain. So this is new variables where 0 now corresponds in the low pain variable to pain centered at low levels of pain. 0 represents a standard deviation below the mean of pain, right? In high pain, 0 now corresponds to a standard deviation above the mean of pain, right? And then what we did is we went through and we created new interaction terms that are going to involve my low pain in PTSD and my high pain at PTSD. So now I've got new interaction terms that correspond to the relation of PTSD and outcome at low and high levels of pain. And now what we're going to do, technically what we should do, and I didn't do this on our output, but yeah, we should probably do it anyway. Just because technically pain is associated with opiate use as well. We should probably say low pain opiate use, high pain opiate use, low pain, and mathematically this isn't going to make a difference, at least with the way this model is set up, but conceptually going to be important, right? Because if we put low pain, if we have a new variable that's recentered, a new recentered pain variable where 0 now corresponds to low levels, anytime pain appears in our model, we want to make sure that that low pain variable is used with stuff across the board. Technically, it's not going to make a difference in the evaluation of our simple slopes, but just to get you in the habit of being consistent with stuff, right? So remember, we've got pain plus opioid plus PTSD plus pain times PTSD plus pain times opioid use, right? And so if I've recentered pain and plugged it in here and here, I probably need to have it in this guy as well, right? And so that's what we're doing here. Now it's not going to have an impact on coefficients, but we just want to make sure that we're all even Steven on stuff. Okay. People see why we did that, and that wasn't on your, I didn't include that on the handout, but I should. All right. So, but if you have a model with only one interaction term, then you only need to set one, put together one set of interactions. Okay. So we're going to go through and run this. Okay. And so now what we want to do, we're going to take this regression model, our base model. Okay. And I'm going to take for pain, I'm going to substitute low pain. And my pain times PTSD, I'll take low pain times PTSD and substitute that there. And then I've got a low pain times opiate use, substitute that there. Okay. So what I've done is I've just taken my model and plugged in my new variables with pain centered at low levels. I'm going to take that and run my other one where I'm going to take low pain, substitute low pain with high pain, opiate use PTSD, and I've got high pain times PTSD, high pain times opiate use. There we go. Okay. So people see what we did there? All right. So we go run through, run this model. So go through taking a look at what we've got here. So we've got, this is our low pain model. Okay, so what we've done is this is our model conditioning the relation of PTSD on outcome at low levels of pain. Okay. So Angeline, what coefficient am I most interested in this table? Am I interested in my interaction of low pain and PTSD? Take a look at the coefficient for your interaction of pain here and your interaction from your base model. Are they different? No, they're not. Which one? So what are we looking for here? Anything else? PTSD, right? Because if I look at now, remember in my base model, my coefficient for PTSD represented the relation of PTSD with outcome at average levels of pain. But I've screwed with pain. I've changed that around. So now my coefficient for PTSD represents the relation between PTSD and functioning at low levels of pain, right? And I can see that my coefficient here, 0.413. 0.413 is statistically significant. I've got effect sizes down here, right? Real quick, Stephanie Swift, what did we hand calculate that coefficient to be? Negative 0.413, right? Everything lines up. I can't impress how important it is. You will screw this up. It's a lot of moving pieces and parts. The more you can go through and make sure that things are the same, the better off you're going to be. Okay. As you work through these models, your interaction terms should always be identical. Doesn't matter. Your highest order interaction terms should never change. Okay. Now this is a little bit funky. Because you're going to see a change in your coefficient for your intercept, right? So if you compare this to your base model, your intercept has changed. That makes some sense because you've recentered pain around, right? Your coefficient for pain hasn't changed. Your coefficient for opiate use, though, has changed because that was we've now conditioned, because pain and opiate use were in our interaction, now we've conditioned opiate use at low levels of pain instead of at average levels of pain, so that's going to change. This coefficient is going to change because it was involved in an interaction. Same with PTSD. PTSD is going to be changed because it was involved in an interaction. So you're going to see those first order effects change. But, Morgan, tell me what in the base model, what was the coefficient for the interaction of PTSD and pain?
Significance?
No, just the term, the coefficient.
Oh, 0.17.
1.7. What about for PTSD and opiate or pain and opiate use?
4.60.
4.60, right? So your highest order, your interaction terms, highest order interaction terms aren't going to change. If you had a three-way interaction term, your two-way interactions would change, which are one or your three ways would. Okay. So here, these are the same. Opiate use and PTSD are both involved in interactions with pain, and so those base effects are going to change around, but your pain coefficient isn't. But the whole reason we've run this model is just to look at the relation of PTSD with outcome. Your models, your R-squareds, all that's going to be identical, right? The only thing that is of concern here is the relation between PTSD and outcome at low levels of pain, which is the exact same coefficient that we hand calculated, so we know that we're on the right track. We're just going to go through and say, yep, that's a statistically significant effect, and then if we wanted to pull coefficients or effect sizes, we could go through and do that. Same thing, if we go down through and we take a look at coefficients for high levels of pain. Lauren, what are we most interested here? PTSD. What do we hand calculate the coefficient for simple slope PTSD at high levels of pain to be? What is it? .043, right? Right there. Right, so we hand calculated exactly, right? And so it matches up. And this is why going through and factoring those models out by hand is going to be important. As Stephanie does it appear that PTSD has a unique relation with role functioning at high levels of pain? Mm-hmm. Nope, right? Significance value, the relation of PTSD with role functioning condition on high levels of pain is not statistically significant. It's about 0.7, right? And so again, all we've done here is just to take a look at the significance value and then maybe effect sizes here at high levels of pain. Okay. But everything else is this is the only coefficient that we're really interested in, right? Aside from checking that our constant and our simple slopes coefficient is within rounding error of what we hand calculated. If that shapes up, you're good to go. Okay, so this is a really nice way to check yourself. Do it by hand, then run it in SPSS, make sure that all that adds up, and if it does, then you know that you've done it correctly. But be prepared, you're going to screw this up a lot, right? There's just a lot of working parts, and you want to have some fail-safes, making sure everything sums to 0. Okay? Questions about this? All right. Let's go through, I guess just for the sake of, well, actually, no, let's not do that. All right, so we want to go through and take a look now, because we had another function that we wanted to, because we wanted to look at the conditional effect of pain on functioning for people who aren't taking opiates. Okay, so now this is a little bit different because we've got a dichotomous moderator here. Okay, so same thing as we did last time. We can go through and should go through and start out with our base model, right? But this time, our conditional effect is what, Lauren? Pain.
Yeah.
Opiate use is our moderator, pain is our conditional effect, right? So we go through and we've got our equation from our base model. We bring down terms that aren't related to our conditional effect. So intercept comes down, pain's my conditional effect, so I'm going to hold on to that. Opiate use isn't my conditional effect. PTSD isn't. Pain and PTSD, it's got pain in there, but I'm going to plug in 0 for PTSD, and that's going to go away. So I can pull this down. And so what I'm left with is pain, my coefficient for pain here, and opiate use times pain. I'm going to factor this out. So I'm going to bring 10.046 here, 4.603 times opiate use. Now once I factored pain out, have my moderating function here. If I go through and I drop in zeros because I'm holding PTSD constant at the mean, I put zeros in, that goes away, 0 and that goes away, and I'm left with 10.038 minus my effect, my slope for opiate use, plus my moderating function, negative 10.046 plus 0.4603 times opiate use, all that times pain. Right? So we can see that my effective pain on outcome is going to be dependent on what I plug in there for opiate use. Right? And again, the way to double check your math on this, if we take this and factor it out and get back up, or if I take this and factor it out and I get back up to here, you know we've done it right. Okay. So now this is a little bit different, right? Because what we've got is before we entered high and low level, or a standard deviation above and a standard deviation below, to get high and low levels of my moderator. But here, I don't want to plug in a standard deviation above or below, because the standard deviation doesn't actually correspond to anything, right? What I want to go back through is I want to go through and take a look at in my data set, for this centered opiate term, what values correspond to people who don't take opiates and people who do. Here, and again, because I've got a balanced design, negative 0.5 is people who don't use opiates, 0.5 is people who do use opiates. And so what I'm going to do is now, instead of using standard deviation above and below, when I have a dichotomous moderator, I'm just going to plug in the values that correspond to people who are low and people who are high, okay? And if I do that, I go through, and so I've got my calculating my simple slopes. So I've factored this down, and now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put in, for people without opiate use, I'm just going to plug in negative 0.5, because that corresponds in my data set to people who don't use opiates, right? So I plug negative 0.5 in there, get my simple slopes for pain. Here, take the same function, plug in 0.5, because that's corresponding to people who are using opiates. Give me my simple slopes for pain condition on people who are using opiates. Okay. If I go through, and then again, if I substitute high and low levels, standard deviation above, standard deviation below for pain, I then get my simple slopes graph here, where for my people who aren't using opiates, this is expected value of role functioning for low levels of pain, expected values of role functioning for people who are using pain, or if I use my people who are using opiates, so if I plug values into this equation here, low levels of pain, this is my expected functioning, high levels of pain, expected functioning, again, I'm just plugging in standard deviation above and below, plus or minus. So again, what I end up with is my simple slopes graph. So my simple slopes and my graph for individuals, the relation between pain and functioning for people who aren't using opiates. So I can again do all this by hand. I don't need to use SPSS to do this, but I still want to know what these both look statistically significant, right? And I know, based because my interaction is statistically significant, I can say that these are reliably different, right? But what I want to do is I maybe want to get p-values because I want to report that, right? And maybe want to report effect sizes for the relation of pain and function. And so this ends up being a little bit different because what I can do is I'm going to go through now same type of process, but this time what I'm going to do is I've already got a variable here where opiate use corresponds to where opiate use is associated with 0 means no opiate use, 1 means opiate use, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through, and there's a lot of different ways you can do this. This is what I do just because it's easiest. I'm going to sort my opiate, then I'm going to insert a variable, and now for wherever opiate use is 0, I'm going to put 1. Where the opiate use is 1, I'm going to put 0. So Sam, what have I just done? I just reversed it, right? Now people, so I've got 2 opiate variables. In one, the one I started out with, 0 means no opiate use, 1 means opiate use, right? That's typically how we code things because it makes sense. What I just did is I just reversed it, and so now 0 corresponds to people who do use opiates, and 1 corresponds to people who don't. Anybody see where I'm going with this? Remember, 0 is important because 0, anything coded 0 is who we're looking at effects for, okay? So what I can do now is I can go to my, I can go through and I can compute and I can say no opiate times pain is going to be opioid times centered pain. Again. Or not centered opiate. Right on. Okay. So what I'm doing is I'm creating 2 new interaction terms. The first one is going to be a new interaction term looking at the relation of pain and opiate use, where people who aren't using opiates is coded as 0. Okay. This is going to give me the relation of PTSD or pain and functioning when people are opiate use is coded as 0, corresponding to people who aren't using opiate use. Okay. So then, Sam, what did I do with this second term? What is this going to tell me? What am I going to use that interaction term for? If this is going to tell me the relation between pain and functioning for people who aren't using opiates, what's this one going to do for me? Yeah, and why is it going to do that? What do you think, Angela? Because I reversed it. Now 0 means people who are using opiates, right? And so what I can do is I can just take that dichotomous variable and I can just flip it around, right? So 0 now corresponds to people who are. And if 0 is always my sort of my base relation, my sort of people of interest, now I've just recoded my data so that people who are using opiates are coded 0. And so now I can go through and take a look at that.
Did you name that variable to opioid R? Is that what, like the one we just created?
Yep, I just named the in our data file, it just opioid R.
Okay.
Okay. And so opioid, this is nice because opioid use isn't in any other interaction term or anything like that, right? So we don't have to worry about going through and creating other new things. But what I can do now is if I go back up to my base model, okay, I go to okay. So I want pain is fine because pain is my my conditional effect. Opiate use though, now I need to, I don't want to use my centered opiate variable. I want opiate use where opiate use is coded 0, no, 1, yes. Okay, and then PTSD, pain times PTSD, I don't have to worry about that. But then I'm going to substitute my opiate use times pain interaction. Remember, this was originally centered opiate use and pain. I'm going to plug in my new term corresponding to when opiate use is coded 0, 1, and plug that interaction term in. And then take this and paste this down again. Okay, and this is going to be opiate R, where people who are using opiates are now coded 0, and plug in my new interaction term that I've created with that recoded opiate use. Okay, and so what I've done here is I'm looking at my simple slopes, right? Here I've taken before we had opiate use centered just so we kind of got that out of the way, right? But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my uncentered variable and just plug this in, because 0 is the people who I'm interested in, right? My regression model is always going to tell me effects for people whose values are 0. Well, If I want to look at people who aren't using opiates, then I'm just going to code opiates use, so people who aren't using opiates are coded as 0. I already had that variable in my data set. But then I need to create a new interaction term with the uncentered variable. And then I want to go through and I want to look at the opposite direction. I want to look at the relation of pain on outcome with people who are using opiates. So then I just created a different variable where people who are using opiates are coded 0. People who aren't coded as 1, created a new interaction term and dropped that in there. And if I go through and I run this, run these models, okay. All right, Stephanie. So this is my model where I've included as a predictor opiate use coded 0, 1. Okay. What effect am I interested in looking at here? Okay. What's my conditional effect in this model? We did PTSD. What's our conditional effect now? Pain, right? And so if I look at pain, I see I've got a oh yeah, that's right. Okay. So if I look at my conditional effect of pain for people who aren't using opiates is now 12.347. Okay. Katie, what did we expect it based on the calculation of our simple slopes by hand? For no opiate use, yeah. Okay, so we did it right. Things turned out right. And is that a statistically reliable relation? Yeah, right. And so I can go through and take a look at my effect sizes again. Again, in this model, because if I go through and I take a look at, compare this model to my base model that I ran, I'm going to see a difference in my constant and my coefficient for pain, but everything else is going to be identical, right? Because I didn't screw around. This isn't, opiate use isn't involved in any other interaction terms. So all of my other effects, the only thing that's going to change is my constant and my coefficient for pain, right? And so I see that for people who aren't using opiates, pain holds a reliable negative relation with functioning with a really strong effect here, right? And then if I go down through, take a look at my other model, right? This is my model where I reverse when I flip the coding of that 0, 1 variable. So now 0 corresponds to people who are using opiates. If I go down through, I take a look at my pain coefficient here, it's changed, right? My intercept has changed, my pain coefficient has changed. Katie, is this statistically significant? Yeah, it is, but my effect size is quite a bit smaller, right? And so what I'm saying here is pain holds a reliable association with functioning, right? For people who are and aren't using opiates, it doesn't matter if people are or aren't using opiates, pain still holds a reliable association with reduced functioning. But it looks like that association is stronger for people who are not using opiates as opposed to those who are. And I knew that based on my hand calculation, my factoring of my simple slopes, right? Only thing this SPSS is doing is it's giving me a test of significance for the relation of my conditional effect for people with and without using who are and aren't on opiates, and then I can also grab an effect size off of that. But in this case, all my other variables all my other coefficients are going to be identical. The only thing that's going to change is the value of my conditional effect. So this is a little more straightforward than the last one. The last one, everything kind of got jumbled up because pain was, my moderator was also incorporated in another interaction term, and so then a lot of stuff got jumbled up. Here, everything stayed the same except for my conditional effect. But again, if I go through and I take a look at my constant and I look at my coefficient for pain that I calculated by hand with my simple slopes, it should be identical to what we get, or within rounding error, what we got from SPSS if we've done everything correctly. All right. Questions about this? It's a lot to take in, okay? These are fairly standard analyses in terms of questions that we get in social sciences, but people don't do this well a lot of the time, right? My concern now is we've got an automated macro that is really slick and helpful for running these types of models, but it alleviates people of having to understand what they're doing, which I'm concerned about. I'm already starting to see stuff in reviewing papers where people are just plugging stuff into a macro and then just reporting whatever comes out, even though it doesn't make any sense. You would recognize it doesn't make sense if you know what you're up to, right? So I'm going to encourage you all, or well, force you all, to become able to do this by hand so you know what's going on in doing this, and then if you decide to use a different program down the road, fine, whatever, but at least you'll know the ins and outs and workings of this. Okay. Questions on this? Okay, cool. Let's take a break. Okay. So, going through, and so to this point, we've been talking about working with models that have either continuous variables or dichotomous variables. Okay, both of these are, at least in terms of predictors, we can have continuous predictors, dichotomous predictors. All that's fair game within our regression models. But sometimes we're going to run into situations where we have variables that aren't 0, 1. They're not binary. They're not continuous, right? They're just literal categorical variables, like for experimental folks, right? If you have, say, 3 conditions, right? Now all of a sudden, we've kind of got into an area where a standard regression model, you can't just plug 0, 1, 2 in there, because your SPSS is going to count that as a ordered categorical variable when if your variables don't have any type of order, your levels don't have any type of order in them, you're going to get nonsensical results, right? So we need to have some sort of procedure to go through and be able to, we want to be able to look at categorical variables in our analyses as well. I will tell you, in general, anytime you incorporate categorical data analyses into your model, you're asking for greater levels of complexity and headache, just so that you're aware. To the extent that you can use dichotomous indicators or continuous indicators, that's going to be great, but sometimes you can't, right? And if you can't, we want to be able to have it at least give you guys a sense for how you might handle some of that type of stuff, okay? So if we've got multicotomous indicators, right? If we've got some variable that has at least 3 or more levels, a number of different ways we can go through and take a look at this, but one of the ways that we can go through and do is we can go through and start dummy coding things. Okay? With the dummy code, what we're going to do is we're going to choose some specific group as our reference group. Okay, so if we are running an experiment, right, and we have some sort of control group and then 2 experimental groups, what we might do is we might set that experimental group as our reference group, and then create dummy codes to compare each one of our experimental groups to that reference group. Okay, so with a dummy code, what we're going to end up with is G-1 codes that's going to compare each group to the reference group. So if I've got 3 conditions, how many dummy codes am I going to have? 2, right? If I've got 5 groups, right? Let's say I've got a big like national data set, and there's say 5 different racial ethnic groups that I want to take a look at, right? And I've got like reasonable representation because we've got the whole country, right? How many dummy codes would I have there? 4, right? And so what we can do is we can start going through and modeling these categorical data using dummy codes. Now, dummy codes aren't the only way we can go through and do this, but it's just one of the most common and oftentimes provides intuitive information that map onto the types of things that we'd like to take a look at. Okay, So this is straight out of Aiken and West. Have you all, show of hands, be honest, who's been reading Aiken and West? All right. Read this. It's going to be very helpful as you're trying to go through it. It's old school, right? It's more of an old school stat textbook. It's going to be considerably more dry than Tabachka-Bedell and more than Howell even as well, right? But still, that little skinny, expensive textbook ends up still being the kind of the gold standard for working through some of this stuff. So it'll be important, it'll be helpful if you go through and take a look at that. But, so this is a new example for all of you. But they go through looking at how you might go about incorporating dummy codes to look at moderation analysis. So what we've got here is a set looking at the relation between education and income. And we've got a couple questions looking at the unique association of degree and GPA with starting salary, right? And to what extent that degree type moderates the association between GPA and starting salary, right? The idea being that for different types of people receiving different degrees, their starting salary is probably going to differ, right? And a lot of pressure to get good grades. So what is your GPA? What effect does your GPA have on your starting salary? And then do these two things interact with one another, right? The relation between GPA, college GPA and starting salary, does that differ across different types of degrees? Okay. And so in this example, what we've got is we've got a categorical indicator with 3 levels, right? We've looked at people with a liberal arts degree, an engineering degree, and a business degree, okay? This is a straight up nominal variable, right? We can't order these in any type, there's no sort of 1, 2, 3 about it, right? This is just different types of degrees. And so what we can do though, we can't just, if we stick 1, 2, 3 in our regression model, it's gonna give us coefficients. Those coefficients aren't gonna make any sense, right? I mean, you can interpret it, you can say, oh, this is what it means. That's not what it means because it's not a variable that belongs in that model, okay? But what we can do is we can set this up with a series of dummy codes, right? And let's say that we want liberal arts as our reference group, okay? And so if we're going to create dummy codes, what we're going to do is we've got 3 levels. We're going to create 2 dummy codes. We're going to create a dummy code for engineering, where if people you receive an engineering degree, they're going to get a 1. And if they get a liberal arts or business, they're going to have 0. Okay? Then we're going to have a dummy code for business, where if people have a business degree, they're going to get a 1. If they're engineering or liberal arts, they get a 0. Right? Do not include then a dummy code for liberal arts, because then you're going to have collinearity. Right? If you throw all 3 of those in the model, everything's going to come crashing down, because if I know what your value is for the dummy code for engineering and for business, I can perfectly predict the value you have for liberal arts, and that's going to make your whole thing come apart, right? So with dummy codes, it's always going to be the number of categories minus 1. That's the number of dummy codes you're going to have in the model. Okay? We'll see how we set this up. And if we're looking at SPSS, right? So we've got participant number. Here's your degree. Here's your GPA. Here's your salary. We're going to create a new dummy code so that if you have an engineering degree, you've got 1. All else is 0. For business, if you've got a business degree, 1, all else 0. Just creating a couple new variables in your set, and then make sure to label those, right? Always label them, because you'll always forget. You want to make sure that you know what you're up to. Okay. Questions about this? All right. So, if we just want to do a group comparison, right? We're not worried about interaction terms yet. We just want to know whether or not we see differences in starting salary across people who graduate with different degrees. What we could do is we could regress starting salary onto our dummy code for engineering and our dummy code for business. And if we were to do that, let's say this is the equation we get. We get a regression equation: 21,000 plus 6,999 for engineering, 3,000 for our dummy code for business. So, our coefficients that we get out of here, right? Our intercept here is going to correspond to our mean salary for a liberal arts degree. Why is this, Morgan?
Because it's the reference group.
This is a reference group. Why does this make sense given our equation?
Because these are the difference between the reference group and engineering each of the degrees.
Okay. So if I'm a liberal arts degree, right? What's my value for engineering?
0.
What's my value for business? 0. Those two fall away, and I'm just left here, right? And so my intercept is going to be the expected value, the expected starting salary for individuals who have a degree in liberal arts. Functionally, this is the mean salary for people with liberal arts. Okay? I mean, that's all it is. This is just a mean value. If you went through these data and looked at the mean value, the mean starting salary for people with liberal arts, it would be 21,000. Okay? So we can go through, and this is just a flat line, right, for people with liberal arts degree. Our beta 1 here is going to be the difference in the mean salary for people with engineering versus liberal arts. Angeline, can you tell me why that is?
Because you're holding the salary, the difference of 0.
Right. But plug in, if I'm an engineer, then this is value is 1, right? That value is 0, right? And so what I end up with is this coefficient here is the difference in my starting salary of engineers from people with a liberal arts degree. If I add my constant and that coefficient, this is going to be the mean salary for people with an engineering degree. Same thing, if I look at beta 2, this is going to be the difference in mean salary for business versus liberal arts. I guess if I'm a business degree, and I've got a 1 for here, I've got a 0 for engineering, that goes away. $3,000 is the difference between people who have the starting salary for people with a liberal arts degree versus business. And if I add those two up, I've got my mean value for, or my mean starting salary for individuals with a business degree. Okay. Our hypotheses, our overall regression model here, right, tests our hypotheses that salary doesn't differ across degrees. Why does this make sense? If we think about degree not predicting anything in terms of salary, that by definition means that on average, doesn't matter what degree you get, there's no difference in your average salary, right? So everything is going to be the same. Okay. What have we essentially done here? What have we ran? An ANOVA, right? We just ran an ANOVA and a regression, right? Remember that ANOVA is just a special case of regression. T-tests are just a special case of regression. It's all part and parcel of the general linear model, right? If this was the question that we had, it would probably be easier just to run it as an ANOVA model. This is just a one-way ANOVA model, right? But we don't need to. We can very easily run it in a regression, right? And if I found that my beta 1 was statistically significant, what would that mean? 70? B1, engineering.
Oh, that engineering is significantly different from the other two.
The other two?
The other two.
Is it the other two?
Oh, from the reference.
From the reference group, right? This statistical test for my coefficient for engineering tells me whether or not there's a reliable difference in starting salary between engineers and liberal arts majors, right? My statistical significance of my coefficient here is going to tell me whether or not there's a reliable difference between starting salary for people in business and liberal arts. Okay? My statistical test for beta naught is telling me whether or not people with a liberal arts degree have a starting salary that's different than 0. It's questionable. I don't know. Okay? But do people kind of see what we're doing with these dummy codes and getting this all set up here? Okay. So again, starts to become a flexible way to do the same things we would do in an ANOVA model. Okay. But what happens now if we want to take a look at differences in starting salary across, or looking at the relation of GPA accounting for degree, right? I want to look at the relation between GPA and starting salary, but I want to control for different types of degrees that we might have, right? In this case, what I might do is I still got my 2 dummy codes, but now I'm going to throw a center GPA variable in there, right? Now we're doing something that we can't do in ANOVA, a straight ANOVA, okay? What we're going to do is we're going to look at the unique effect of degree type and GPA on starting salary, right? So what we do is we regress starting salary onto a dummy code for engineering, onto our dummy code for business, and then onto our center GPA variable, and this is the equation we get, right? If we want to take a look at our coefficients, beta naught, this is still the mean salary for liberal arts majors, holding GPA constant at 0. And in this case, it means the mean. Which mean? The grand mean, right? The mean of everybody in the sample, because what's probably, I suspect there's probably differences in GPA across people who have engineering and business and liberal arts degrees, right? Anybody have friends who are engineers? A C in an engineering class is different than a C in a psychology class, right? So there's probably differences here, but the way we look at across, say, all 3 of these majors, if we hold that GPA constant at the mean, this is our expected starting salary for individuals with a liberal arts degree at mean GPA, okay? Our coefficient here is the difference in the mean salary across engineers and liberal arts majors, controlling for degree, right? Beta 2, the difference between mean salary for business versus liberal arts, controlling for GPA, and then this coefficient here, change in expected salary per unit change in GPA for liberal arts. So I mean, why is this technically for people with a liberal arts degree?
Because the 1 and 2 are held constant at 0, which means
Right. So if we hold these 2 constant at 0, we're by definition talking about people who have a liberal arts degree. Okay. And so if we plot this out, again, this is an additive model. This is the technical interpretation of this, but Lauren, do we see differences in these slopes for people who have liberal arts engineering or business degrees? No, we don't, right? Because they can't be. In this additive model, there's no way for this relation of salary or the relation of GPA and starting salary to differ across each one of these degrees. Angeline, what would we need to do to look at whether or not the relation between GPA and salary differs across graduates of different majors? We have to look at interaction terms, right? So you're absolutely right. This is represents the relation between GPA and outcome and salary for people who have a liberal arts degree, because by definition we're holding everything's constant at 0. But technically that doesn't change, right? And so the difference between in salary between engineers and liberal arts majors, we're controlling for GPA, so we see an adjustment in that mean, which is what we're doing with analysis of covariance, right? But it doesn't matter, so that difference is the same no matter what GPA we're talking about in here, right? And so this is what our model is doing, but we might have an idea that this might not accurately reflect the phenomena that we're actually interested in, right? We might find that for some degrees, like liberal arts, that maybe there's a pretty strong relation between GPA and starting salary, versus engineers, you just complete. It doesn't matter if you're a superstar or you just manage to get through the program, there's not a real strong relation between GPA and starting salary, right? And so what we would need to do to go through and look at that is start creating some interaction terms. Okay? People understand sort of the model here, what we've got going on? All right, so what we're going to go through is we're going to start creating some, including some interaction terms that are going to look at differences in the relation between GPA and starting salary based on different degrees, right? In our additive model, we can't ask this question. When we can ask it, the model's just not going to tell us. But as soon as we start incorporating interaction terms in here, we can start looking at more nuanced ways in which this whole thing plays out. So we go through, and what we do is we regress our salary, starting salary, onto our dummy code for engineering, our dummy code for business, our center GPA, the interaction of engineering and GPA, and the interaction of our dummy code for business and GPA. Okay? I'm going to tell you this right now, do not center your dummy codes. Dummy codes are not to be centered. Dummy codes are 0 1s all the time. You're going to get yourself in a bind if you try and center your dummy codes. Don't do it. Just what you're going to end up with, you're going to end up with collinearity in your model, but that's fine. It doesn't actually impact your statistics or your results at all. It's just, at least in OLS regression. Try doing it in like an N+ or a maximum likelihood that can start to fool around with stuff. But for your dummy codes, if you're using multi-cognitive variables, don't try to do and center stuff like we did for the previous analysis. That's going to screw up the whole thing. Okay. But so what we've done is we've regressed starting salary on a 0 1 for engineering or everything else, a 0 1 for business or everything else, center GPA, and then our interaction of our dummy code, our 0 1 for engineering times GPA, our dummy code, our 0 1 for business times GPA. Okay? And if we do this, right, we go down through and we take a look at this model, right? And we want to look at our simple slopes, okay? Our simple slopes for our liberal arts degree is going to be our intercept here plus my coefficient for GPA, okay? Why is this, Sam? Yeah, so if I want to look at the simple slopes, I want to look at the relation between GPA and starting salary for individuals with liberal arts. This is what my simple slopes equation is. Why is this? Why does this correspond to people with a liberal arts degree?
Because you took the other stuff out.
Why did that other stuff fall away?
Because those were
Well, it counts in what? Right. So if I hold everything else constant at 0, if I put 0, this means I'm not an engineer, right? So that goes away. If I put it 0 for this, it means I'm not a business major. And if I'm not a business major and I'm not an engineer, who am I? I'm a liberal arts person, right? That goes away. Here's a 0, that goes away. Here's a 0, that goes away. So by definition, my GPA coefficient here corresponds to the relation between GPA and starting salary for individuals who graduated with the liberal arts degree. Okay. Now my simple slopes for engineering, I'm going to have my intercept, my coefficient for engineering, and then I'm going to have my coefficient for GPA. Then we're going to drop down here, and then I'm going to sort of subtract the coefficient for GPA here, right? Because again, if I'm looking at engineering, I put a 1 here, I put a 0 here, that goes away. I bring this down, I put a 1 here, which ends up being 667 times GPA. I put a 0 here because I'm not a business major, that goes away. My simple slopes ends up turning out pretty easy and straightforward. I go through, play this out. This is my simple slopes for engineering. Same thing for business. I'm a business major. 0, I'm looking for business majors, so 0 here for engineering, that goes away. 1 for business, that comes down. GPA comes down. Engineering, nope, because I'm looking at business, that goes away. 1 for this, or 1 times center GPA is just GPA, that comes down. Here's my simple slopes for the relation of GPA and starting salary for people in the business degree. Okay. And so again, my intercept is just the mean salary for people in the liberal arts degree holding GPA constant at the mean. B1, this is the difference in mean salary for engineering versus liberal arts. with GPA at 0. Same thing, B, this is a difference in mean salary for business versus liberal arts at GPA held constant at the mean. My coefficient here for GPA is expected change in salary per unit change in GPA for liberal arts, right? Again, if liberal arts is my reference group, this is just the simple slopes here, right? B3 plus B4 is association between GPA and salary for engineers, right? So here, B3, the GPA, and B4 engineers a 1, so then that just reduces down to B4 times this coefficient. We get our simple slope for engineer, same thing, 1 here, 1 here, we just get 790 GPA, 1082 GPA, add those together, that ends up being our simple slopes there. Okay, so again, when you're working with your regression equations, like, don't be afraid of the actual function. Take a look at that, because that's going to tell you a whole lot of stuff. Because if you start thinking about who am I talking about, well, I'm talking about a liberal arts major, so that means that they're not a business major and they're not an engineer, so that stuff goes away. This is what I'm left with. Okay. And so if we go through and plot this out, okay, so this is what we get if we want to go through and take a look at differences between GPA for our individual groups and our reference group, which is our liberal arts groups, right? But what about if we just wanted to switch around, we want someone else to be our liberal arts, or our reference group? Looking at my simple slopes or testing in SPSS, simple slopes for liberal arts is easy, right? This is just this coefficient, or excuse me, this coefficient for GPA, right? And if I run this model in SPSS, my coefficient for GPA is my simple slopes for liberal arts majors, right? But if I want to test the statistical significance of these, right, I can get these by hand, but SPSS isn't going to give, I can't get the tested statistical significance for these in my base model, right? So what I can do is then I can just go, let's say I want to get a simple slope for engineer, right? What I'm going to do then is I'm just going to create a new variable. I'm going to create a dummy code for liberal arts and keep my dummy code for business, right? It's going to be a different one. So my dummy code for liberal arts is going to be 1 if you're a liberal arts major and 0 if you're engineering and business. My revised dummy code for business is going to be 1 for business and 0 for engineering and 0 for liberal arts, right? And then when I go through and rerun the model, my base model, just as I did before, but now with my new interaction terms with my new dummy codes. Okay? Same thing if I want to do the same thing for business, create a new, keep my dummy code for liberal arts, create a new dummy code for engineering where engineering is 1 if you're an engineer, but 0 if you're in business or liberal arts, right? And then I just go through, reconfigure my original base model with my new dummy codes and relevant interactions, and now my test for GPA is going to be my simple slopes for for people in business. Right? And so if I go through and I take a look at this, we see that for engineering, we really don't get much of a relation between GPA and starting salary. It's pretty flat, right? But if I go through and I look at business, see a strong relation here, see a modest relation here for liberal arts, right? Again, pretty actually easy and straightforward. I'm just playing around with my dummy codes because whatever, in this case, what's my conditional effect in this whole setup? What's my conditional effect? Okay, not my reference group. What's my conditional effect? What's my conditional effect and what's my moderator? What do you think, Sophie? Flip it around. Great. Okay, right. my moderator, right? Because what I'm interested in is the relation between GPA and starting salary at different types of degrees, right? So again, your conditional relation is always your base relation, right? Your moderator is the thing that we're going to be changing around, right? So in this situation, with this dummy code, my coefficient for GPA is always going to be my simple slope for whatever my reference group is. So if I want to get a test of the simple slopes for my other groups, all I have to do is just make those other groups my reference group, right? And I can just do that by switching around my creating new dummy codes so that whatever group I'm interested in is now my reference group, and then I just look at my coefficient for GPA here. Okay, and so here we see, again, I can do all this. I can get my simple slopes just by factoring things out, right? That's easy. But if I want to go through and I want to get a test of whether or not that's a statistically reliable association, that's when I need to go through and start playing around with things in SPSS. So here we see that for every unit increase in GPA, I see a $790 increase in my starting salary if I'm a liberal arts major. If I'm engineering, I only see a $123 increase expected per unit increase in my GPA if I'm an engineer. But if I'm a business person, close to $2,000 increase in starting salary per unit increase in GPA, right? This seems like a pretty big difference, right? And I can plot this out, but I want to know, so what I might be interested in is GPA related to starting salary if I'm an engineer, right? Well, I don't know, but what I can do is that I can just now reconfigure my model so engineering is now my reference group. And to do that, I just create a dummy code for liberal arts, where liberal arts is 1, everything else is 0. Business is 1, everything else is 0, right? And now what I do is then just recalculate my model with interaction terms, looking at the relation, and then take a look at my coefficient for GPA in my engineering model, and probably I'm going to find that that's not statistically significant, right? And so then what do I make of this? And so this is what I'm always, and you guys are doing a nice job, but I'm always like beating you over the head and saying, okay, tell me what this means conceptually. What does this model suggest conceptually?
Strong relation with salary for engineers,
But
it does for business.
Yeah.
And maybe overall personal.
right. And so I mean, like, this is the type of stuff when you all are working through these types of problems, I was thinking about it like this take-home message, right? So it looks like, man, if I can just crank my way through an engineering degree and just pass and get it, I'm probably going to be doing okay. Like, I probably don't need to work myself up into a tizzy about my GPA, right? But if I'm a business major, yikes, that's impacted my cash, right? If I get a B, right? So I'm going to go through and maybe have a more of a focus for people here, and then liberal arts degrees, and Starbucks kind of depends, it cares about your GPA, but not a whole lot, right? So again, wanting to tie into this practical sense for kind of what's going on with your model. Okay. Questions about this? All right. Real quick, talk about one thing that can happen, and Aiken and West talk about this. I think it's interesting. If I have a situation where my conditional effect and my moderator are really strongly correlated, okay? What can happen is sometimes if I run a moderation model, what I'm actually doing is I might be running my moderation effect, might be a proxy for a quadratic relation in my data, okay? So let's say, because again, my interaction effect is a product term of X and my moderator, okay? But if X and my moderator are really strongly related, I might get a significant effect, significant interaction effect here that might not actually represent a moderation effect. I might actually have a curvilinear effect of a relation of my X variable with my outcome, right? So here is a quadratic effect. This is my predictor this is my outcome. And if I go through and plot this out, right, this is kind of what it looks like. So 3 squared, 2 squared, 1 squared, right? But if the value of my moderator is correlated like 0.9 with my x value, right? This is might be what's actually going on in the data, but if the product of this is kind of about the same thing as that, what it can do is that can actually mask what's really going on in my data, right? And so I might say, oh, I've got this variable moderates the relation between x and my outcome. Well, in actual fact, that's not the case. It's just your x has a nonlinear relation with your outcome, and your moderator is just kind of serving as a proxy for that square term and is kind of working that out, okay? Now, Aiken and West talk about ways to start to tease out interaction effects. In the bivariate case, you should identify that in a screener and already know, right? But in multivariate space, weird things can happen. We can't look into the unique relation of x with outcome, partialing out variance of all of that. If we sort of partial out variance ability attributable to like 4 other predictors, and now you have a curvilinear relation, that's going to be hard to catch in a screener, right? So Aiken and West talk about different ways to go through and make sure that you're not actually capturing a nonlinear term with your interactions, basically going through and including a squared term in there, that in an assignment. But again, it's something to keep in mind. Again, going back to this idea of appropriately specified models, right? You don't want to get jazzed about an interaction effect when what you actually probably should be capturing is a nonlinear relation in your data, right? So we want to keep things in mind there. Now, the difference between these two is often a function of how we're thinking about the data, and this is where it becomes incumbent on you to know your literature, understand how relations should be related, or how variables should be related to one another, things like that, and determine whether or not it makes sense to model things as nonlinear stuff or as an interaction term. It's sort of up to you to make that argument, but know that this is something that can happen. Okay. So we'll finish up with information on power, reliability, things like that. Cool. All right.